Okay, and now on to our evening entertainment. Feel free to giggle and laugh at will when you listen to some of the turkey stories. Joan and I certainly did when we put this together. And they're quite amusing birds, I must admit. I'm going to give you a little information on the history behind the turkey drives. Joan's going to share with you what actually happened on them. And then I'll close up with a little bit of information about what eventually brought an end to them. So, the blackish stream which wove into the morning sun on the narrow Connecticut River meadows was more than a mile long. Its width ranged from a yard or less to more than 50 yards. Viewed from a considerable distance, the blackish stream showed visible bobbings of red and buff. The phenomenon was otherwise unusual. Intermittently, it veered up hills as well as down them and eddied into roadside groves of beech and small acorn oaks and berry brambles. In some part, the far-flung stream was being guided by people. Men and boys tramped ahead, behind, and on the wavering flanks. As the day grew late, the leader men carried lighted lanterns. Other helpers toted wooden buckets filled with shelled or rolling corn, which, like the lanterns, was supplied from high-boarded farm wagons which jounced alongside. The wagons were mostly drawn by horses, and in many instances driven by women. One who watched long enough would have noticed a peculiar orderliness about the procedure. That was the beginning of an article in the 1959 autumn edition of Vermont Life entitled The Great Turkey Drive. The author was Charles Marl Wilson. He was a writer who had a varied career in newspapers, the Army, and was also with an import firm. He was born and educated in Arkansas and moved to Vermont in 1930, where he became interested in turkey drives. He died in 1977 and is buried in Putney. In 1964, he wrote a work of fiction based on stories he heard from Vermonters, and it was entitled The Great Turkey Drive. And it was based on anecdotal evidence that he collected. We tried to find some of his research. His papers are at the University of Vermont, but they only have a rough draft of this book, no notes that he could have taken. But I assume that much of what is in this story is based on real fact. And it's a fun read. It's hard to find, but we do have a copy at the museum if any of you are ever interested in reading it. The idea of driving birds to market is not really new. I found that in Europe it was commonly done. In fact, London was a major destination for meat birds in the British Isles. We first heard about turkey drives from an interview Peter Gilbert did on VPR. And we were sitting at the museum talking about it and were kind of intrigued and thought it might make an interesting program. I went home and looked at the turkeys we were raising and tried to imagine trying to drive them anywhere. Of all the assorted poultry we've had over the years, I would rank them near the bottom on the poultry intelligence scale. In Vermont, turkey drives spanned about a 60 to 70 year period, mostly in the 1800s, although they did go a little bit into the early 1900s. The birds themselves were descended from the pheasant family with an average weight of 25 pounds, so they're considerably bigger than our wild turkeys today. They were gray and black with some buff coloring on their tails and wingtips. The destination market for Vermont turkeys was Boston. This was the home of John Quincy Adams, who, to quote Wilson, was an enthusiastic and eloquent feaster on turkey. One of Boston's mayors, Josiah Quincy, worked to sponsor public markets where turkeys and other produce could be sold. At the time of the turkey drives, freight rates for produce were very high. No railroads existed in northern New England at this time, and turkeys could get to market on their own power. Roads were few and far between, so shipping by wagon was difficult and expensive. It could range from $34 to $45 per ton. Wagons also made proper feeding difficult, so the mortality rate among the birds was high. If driven turkeys could be fed regularly, and they were also able to forage along the route. Many of the turkeys came from farms in northern and central Vermont, and many of the routes drives took were little more than paths through woods, across farmers' fields. Some followed old Indian roads, and routes along the Connecticut River seemed to be quite popular. In Wilson's book, he mentions Terrible Mountain, which those of us in Ludlow know where that is, going to Weston. He also mentions Hapgood Pond and crossing the Connecticut River by ferry in Putney. So there might be a little connection to our area. And Joan, I'll turn it over to you now.
I had this whole thing memorized, but then the tryptophan kicked in, and I'm ready to doze off right now. That turkey was really excellent. Adding on to what Sue had to say, I was thinking, when I first heard about this, I thought, this has got to be the most bizarre thing I've ever heard. And I'm trying to picture all of these turkeys in a line going someplace from point A to B. I mean, think about it. How many times have you seen a turkey around your area, in your yard, across the street, on the side of the road? You might start counting them. Might be 5 here, 10, 15. We're talking turkey drives, not hundreds of turkeys, thousands of turkeys. It was mentioned once, I think it was in 1824, somebody figured out all the farmers that got together had 10,000 turkeys. And as Sue said, how do you get these turkeys to even follow a path along the river? I mean, how are they going to get to Boston? So there were young boys in the family that would go ahead and drop corn on the road, and then that would entice the turkeys to follow the corn, keep them going. So that was very ingenious. And they had wagons loads of corn just to keep them going. It got to the point also that because there were so many turkey drives and the farmers were worried about the feet of the turkey, they would tar the turkey feet. So you can imagine how many, I don't know how many turkeys each farmer had, but they had to tar the feet because in the November it might be frozen ground. The turkeys were going to be hobbling along and not arriving in good condition, so they would have to tar the feet of the turkey. So that was another bit of information. It's just amazing to me. Now, you've heard that whole story about big birds, small brains. Well, the problem with some of our turkeys is that when it came time to sunset, you know what birds do when the sun's going down, they want to roost. So they would roost any place, wherever the sun was going down. It could be a field, but it also could be on a building or in a tree. They would collapse trees. All of a sudden, these thousands of birds would find roofs of churches, houses, buildings, and the buildings would collapse. There was a church in Burke. The whole ceiling collapsed because all of a sudden these thousands of birds are just flocking and roosting on the roofs. At one point, they even said there was a problem with covered bridges. So here you are. You think it's pretty easy. The turkeys are going along. Well, what happens when you're in a covered bridge, especially if it's a long bridge? Well, it's dark. All of a sudden, the turkeys are sitting down, they're going to sleep, and what do? So at one point, I guess some farmers had to hand pick and carry hundreds of turkeys out of the bridge into the daylight so they could continue on their way. I think Sue mentioned there were times, though, when they said, oh, I've got to just get these turkeys moving because they only went about 10 to 12 miles a day. That's from here to Springfield. And they just want to make time and get to Boston and make sure the turkeys are healthy. So they would carry their lanterns just to keep them going at some point. But I just think that's, you know, some of the stories. 1840, there was a priest, John O'Shean. He was in Brattleboro. He's going along in his surrey with the horses, and coming down from the north are all these turkeys. It's getting to be sunset, bad timing for Father. because all of a sudden now the turkeys are on the Surrey cover, they're on his horses, and he's thinking, I gotta escape. So he's trying to get the horses to run faster. Next thing you know, the poor guy, he's covered in, the turkey droppings, and the Surreys are covered, and the poor horses, and the poor guy. It had to be frightening, because if you don't know what's happening, all of a sudden you see these 1,000 turkeys coming towards you, what do you do? As I was doing some of the research, I found out about this woman named Margaret Macarthur. She was born in Chicago, 1928, and she came to Vermont 1948 when she was married to her husband. He was a folk singer physicist, as she says, and they settled in the Newfane, Vermont area. And she was brought up with music, and she was always interested in music and played the harp and some other instruments. And she was just very involved in really liking the traditional ballads, and she liked teaching music and going to different schools. And what happened is she went to a school, I think it was in Newbury, Vermont, which I believe is near Reigate, it's further north. And a group of students, they were talking about the turkey drive, and this is probably like in the 1950s that she was teaching these students. So they made up a song, and I don't have the particular song with me right now, but I have the lyrics. This is all about the turkey drive. Long ago, there was no money in the town we live in now. They sent flocks and herds to Boston of turkey, geese, sheep, and cows. To get turkeys into Boston, they had to travel far, so farmers spread upon their feet heavy coats of tar. Across the Bedell Bridge, a drover boy named Murphy drove on foot to Boston, 150 turkey. Along the Coos Turnpike, many went astray, till he sprinkled corn and gathered many more along the way. And that kind of brings to the point, sometimes, you're driving the turkeys, there might be some foxes, all of a sudden you're missing a few turkeys along the way. But some of the farmers, the turkeys are roosting, they're in their field. Next morning, all of a sudden a few turkeys are missing because those farmers had a great turkey meal the next couple days. They were really enjoying it. So Margaret, probably most of the time that she was in Vermont, from 1948 until she passed in 2006, she went around and gathered ballads, and she listened to different people singing songs and traditional folk songs. And she went to a local recording studio. I don't know where you would find a local recording studio back in 1962, but she signed up for this record company called Folkways Records. And her first album was called Folk Songs of Vermont, and they actually filmed it in her kitchen. And they spent quite a few days recording all the traditional folk songs that she had heard about in this area. Now, when she was born in Chicago, her family had moved around to different parts of the country, and I guess when they went to the Ozarks, her family, maybe in the early 1930s, she noticed that people there sing. Singing is part of their tradition. Everyone sang, and they passed along their history and their culture through songs. So when she came to Vermont, she thought, well, I think I'm going to get interested in this because it's a unique area. I hear people singing. Let me try to record this or gather information and put it into a CD or a record, not a CD back then, but a record that would eventually go into a CD. In the meantime, though, she had also been involved in gathering music with a person called Helen Hartness Flanders. Now, Hartness might sound familiar for some of those of you in the area. Helen was the daughter of James Hartness, who was one-term governor in Vermont, and also was the head of Jones and Lamson machine tool industry in Springfield. She married Ralph Flanders in 1911, and he became a U.S. Senator from Vermont. So all of a sudden she got into this committee in Vermont that wanted her to gather information also about traditional songs, traditions of the country, people in the Vermont area. So for 30 years, she went around and found older generation folks that knew traditional songs, and they were passing it on to their children, But in the 30s, all of a sudden people started listening to the radio, and she was afraid that this next generation was going to lose all those songs, because all of a sudden now they're listening to the radio, they've got new songs, and the old songs that that generation knew might pass by. So she had, back in the early days, they had the wax cylinders, and you could actually record music on these wax cylinders, and then it went to aluminum discs and acetate discs, and then later on into the 30 years of gathering information, it was like on a reel-to-reel tape. During the time that she was almost finished of her 30 years of collecting information, that's when she was acquainted with Margaret Macarthur, and they kind of swapped information and gathered information, because they're all going for the same thing, trying to keep the tradition of the folk ballads alive. Well, we happen to have a song in Margaret Macarthur's album, and it's called Trot Trot to Boston. And so I think if Georgia can cue that up, she's just singing these songs, she's in the kitchen, and you can hear her voice quite clearly. Oh, sure, okay. Oh, just on a side note about the project that we're doing on the street, Main Street of Ludlow in the 1930s, and the students at the 6th grade from Miss Bates's class are painting buildings that are replicas of what's on Main Street back in the 1930s, early 40s. If anyone happens to have any photos or knows of anyone that has any photos of buildings on Main Street during that era, if you could please contact Georgia or myself, and we can scan your photos, and we're going to use them to help duplicate what the actual buildings looked like back then. So if anyone is cleaning out a box this winter, it's a snowstorm going on, and you got some time on your hands, you want to look through some photos, or if you know somebody that has photos of that era, please let us know. We would really appreciate it. Because the students are doing a great job right now. Each student has a particular house, and they're about this big, and they got the correct roof lines, and they're painting them the way we think they have looked in the photos. They're really doing an excellent job. It's a good project. So if you happen to have any photos or know of anyone, let us know. That's the end of that song. Thank you. But that's other songs that she recorded. But if anyone's interested in traditional folk ballads, a lot of the collections of Margaret Macarthur and Helen Hartness Flanders are stored in the Middlebury College. Thank you.
Okay, to finish up. The long turkey drives came to an end in the 1850s with the advent of railroads in Vermont. Drives became a lot shorter, often just from the farm to the nearest railroad depot. By 1857, the Rutland Railroad had developed and put into service the nation's first refrigerated cars. 3 years, I didn't realize that. It was kind of an interesting fact. 3 years later, Vermont Central, another Vermont railroad, also had refrigerated cars. They were actually wooden box cars with a center compartment, and they would fill it, as they said, with good old Vermont ice. Railroads also helped farmers in northern Vermont to add to their flocks by purchasing Canadian turkeys from southern Quebec. Canadian customs agents were not fond of turkey border crossings, since they were supposed to collect duties on each and every bird, ranging from a few cents up to 50 cents. And trying to count a flock of turkeys was a nightmare. So agents would ask the drover how many birds he had. About 250 became the standard reply. So when faced with a choice of accepting 250 or trying to count the birds, the agents would opt for the easy way out. Wilson writes, one able Vermont turkey man from Highgate drove in Canadian turkeys for better than 20 years, never failing to state the number of each flock at 250. One snowy November evening, this is Wilson continuing, old Abe Prentice got his flock to Morse's Line, which was one of the crossings, just as the customs agents were closing up and ready to go home. So you got 250 live turkey birds, bellowed the chief clerk. Old Abe stroked his white beard in gentle amazement. That's right, how'd you ever guess it? Another development that helped end the drives was the opening of New York canals and the advent of steamboats on Lake Champlain. And their fees were generally about 1/4 of wagon rates. So that ends our presentation. If you have questions, we'll try to answer them. Or if any of you know of any information about turkey drives from your family or anything, we'd love to hear about it. So I'll just open the floor if anyone has anything to add.
I just wonder, how many turkeys are around this area?
Sue, can you restate the question before you answer it?
Yes, Lorraine asked, you mean at that time?
No, I mean, as of today, like, there must be a lot.
A lot of turkeys.
Wild turkeys, yeah, yeah. These
They
would,
attack people some places.
turkeys?
Yeah.
Yeah, they can get pretty feisty, particularly in the spring, male turkeys. I can attest to that. Well, anyone have any questions or anything to add?
How long did a trip take?
Joan, it was about
10 miles a day.
10 miles a day and about
10 to 12,
150 miles approximately, so a couple of weeks, anyway.
Do they ever use animals, like such as dog herding, that things to help keep the turkeys together?
Never found any evidence of that.
Dogs wouldn't have helped to herd them together?
I don't know. You know, I really don't know the answer. Yeah. No, there's very little information on these turkey drives, and a lot of it is based on stories old-time Vermonters told, so it's something that hasn't been researched a lot. Yeah, probably. Anyone else have anything they?
The picture that you had in the newspaper, where did you get that from?
Joan, the picture in the newspaper came from?
Oh, that was one of the articles I was Googling, and it popped up as a turkey drive photo. It didn't give any credit to who it was or when it was taken.
I just wonder when the turkeys were, say, maybe 7 pounds or 10 pounds when they left. I wonder, were they 7 or 10 pounds when they got here? Or were they on a shorter one later? Did they gain weight?
Yeah.
I actually have the answer to that.
Joan.
What happened, they were starting to kind of lose weight as they were going along, but they had the corn that was in the wagons. They found feed in the fields, but if the farmers thought that they were too thin, they would actually hold them off from Boston, maybe like a town or two away, and feed them and get them into a group, feed them and try to fatten them up before they brought them to the final market.
I've heard it said that they could grow turkeys up to 80 pounds, but who would buy them?
Good point. Anyone else? Okay, well, if not, thank you very much for coming, and hope to see you again next year.